All right. Well, we are here today in the Well Dwellers podcast at the bottom of the well. My name is Eric Freiberger, and I'm the creator and host here in Treaty 7 Lands, Calgary, Alberta. Today, I'm really excited. I have been dreaming about this moment for a while, of the idea of my old friend and professor, Dr. Mark Love, who I've known since I think around 2012. Joining me here and talking about all things missional and disability and all the stuff that's been on the road that I've journeyed over the last several years, and got to share some of with him and the tribe over in Rochester College, now Rochester University, when Mark was teaching the MRE, the Masters in Religious Education and Missional Leadership. There was so much that I was infused with and really loved in that journey with him and the many other students. And I think Mark was like kind of this new guru to tech as we were doing live streaming for education and community long before it even became a fad. So Mark is a guru in this, and he's also really imparted in me a new sense and understanding of pneumatology and the work of the Spirit in the community was something I really walked away with. I was resistant as a disabled person at first, of fear of what the Holy Spirit in the community is typically framed as. Mark had a beautiful way of showing the work of the Spirit in the Trinity and the community that I never expected. Something we will dive into, I'm sure, lots in this conversation. And he also influenced me musically, as some of you might have noticed this morning in my gym. I had some Gary Clark Jr. going on the record player, and you were the one who introduced me to him. So yeah. So let's start here. Welcome, Dr. Mark Love. Thank you for joining me here at the Well Dwellers podcast.
Eric, it's a great pleasure to be with you, to reminisce a little bit and think through where we were and where we've been and where we're going. So my privilege being here today.
Thank you. Starting with something fun, as I mentioned Gary Clark already, what's been on your record player lately? What are you listening to lately?
Yeah. Let me see. Well, my favorite band is Spoon, and they're coming to our area soon. And they're with a group called the Beths, BTHS. And so I've been listening to them, so I'll know what to expect at the concert. And then I'm going back a lot to kind of more of a country rock thing, which has never really been my thing. And now I'm drawing a blank on names, but I bought a few albums, and what I'm really excited for, though, is I was in Albuquerque a little over a week ago, and my brother lives there, and I had dinner with my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, and he said, I'm never going to buy a turntable, and I have these containers full of albums. Would you be interested in them? And I said, yes. And I don't think he's bought an album in like 30 years. So it was all stuff from when we were younger. And so I came home. I have a few Led Zeppelin albums, but I came home with all of them. And then, I don't know, when I wrote my master's thesis, I did it to a mixtape of Supertramp and Pat Benatar. So all those albums are coming home with me too. Anyway, I've always got the Avett Brothers close by, especially when I want to think about theology. They do a pretty good job of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew Spoon would make it in there too. That's awesome for sure. I think I've got some of those Led Zeppelin albums too. So definitely make the playlist. Pink Floyd. But it's funny. I don't know what it is. I'm getting into some of that country rock myself too.
Ah,
So yeah, it started a bit with Ryan Bingham back a little ways, but definitely. And that F1 movie got Bonnie rocking to I'm as bad as I used to be.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah. So that's awesome. Well, hey, I know I have a lot of questions for you. I have some thoughts, and I thought we'd dive in
All right.
to some of these deeper thoughts. Much of your work centers around Acts 15:28 and the work of the Spirit, as well as you published a book called "It Seems Well with the Spirit and with Us," which I know we'll talk a bit about. It seems to resist tidy answers and instead invites discernment, a communal listening to the Spirit that is slow, embodied, and attentive to those at the margins. Disability theology, as I've encountered over the last several years in a more direct way, often begins in a similar place, not with solutions, but with presence, patience, powerlessness, and proximity. So before we get into some methods and movements, maybe, I'd like to begin here by asking, when you think about the missional church today, who are we most tempted to overlook? And what does that omission reveal about how we listen for the Holy Spirit?
Yeah. Well, I think the fair critique historically of the missional church movement, if you can conceive of it monolithically as one thing, I think the fair criticism is that it hasn't embodied its theology when it comes to being a welcoming kind of community. And I think that's primarily because most of the early thinkers, Daryl Guter, George Hunsberger, Craig Van Gelder, they were all professional missiologists. They were all in the academy. And I think at that point, a long ways from an actual mission context. And so the early writers and thinkers were all like them. They were mostly white male and mostly, again, academic missiologists. So I think it's been hard for them, for us, I should say, I should include myself maybe, to figure out how to be as welcoming and inclusive of other voices as we can be. And I think maybe part of that is because a lot of those academic missiologists were also mainline Protestants. And so they were feeling the loss of Christendom more acutely than, say, an African American church, which has always been on the other side of Christendom, never a part of the power structures of Christian America. So I think the conversation has been historically too insular. It's beginning, I think, to move beyond that. And my prof, Pat Kiefert, has always insisted on doing theology with and for and against and in congregations. So there is more of an honoring of the margins at that point in practice. I think theologically, most people who write about the missional brand have the margins in view when they write, but they don't have much experience living there, and including people who are more from the margins. So I think it's, again, those two things fit together ideologically. God is primarily biblically speaking a mission to marginal communities. I wrote in a blog last week that the whole Bible is literature of people at the margins, that both to and for people at the margins, I should say, from and to people at the margins. No one writing, Paul is the closest to a biblical writer who is a part of the empire because he's a Roman citizen. But otherwise, this is a Galilean movement and a minority movement in the empire, and sometimes persecuted movement. And then you think about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and the way it came to completion, mostly during the exile. And again, now you're an occupied people writing a literature of grief. So I think theoretically, ideologically, there should be a close connection between missional theology and missional practice at the margins. Unfortunately, it hadn't always been that way.
Yeah, I've sometimes wondered that too a lot since I completed the degree with you, is the idea that missional theology and missional brand, as you put it, has kind of become a bit of, well, like you said, a brand. And that seems to draw borders and margins that seem to miss the actual call. From a personal perspective, I found a natural fit that seemed to take me into those marginal communities, particularly disabled. And I think it was almost a subconscious level, Mark. Like I freely admit that back in 2012 and even before that a little bit, my work with house churches and the church community, disability and the marginalization of the disabled was kind of on a subconscious level. I was naturally doing it as a person who's living the missional life, but I wasn't consciously doing it. But as I look back, I realize that when I take the brand off and just live it, it naturally pulls me into those communities and that work.
Yeah. I wonder too, Eric, if the design of our program cultivated some of that because every course required you to do a project that began in your community and not as a place to kind of retail your theology, but as a location that's generative of theology. So for you in particular, then, you're having to think of your primary community as being a generative place to think about God. Our program in particular was, I think, notable by its diversity. I think like 35% of our grads were people of color. Like 20% of our grads were women, which doesn't seem like a lot, except in seminary degrees, that's a lot, you know? So, I don't know. I feel like the the very contextual nature of the program itself developed some sensitivities. Even if we weren't able to fully articulate everything we were doing, we were, as you said, unconsciously developing an imagination. And that's what you're doing now. You're putting that out there and giving it some flesh and bones.
Yeah, I think I think too, and I hope I'm not the only one, but I'm also kind of learning that as I see and become more conscious of that missional calling and flow of natural development theology, that it also I learn from that perhaps mistake or error by the branding of missional, that I don't brand my own kind of disabled missional theology, that it is not siloed into just that, but I see those intersections with other marginal communities, and I allow for that to let the Spirit kind of pour out beyond, let the cup overfloweth, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned some names earlier of missional hermeneutic development. And I think one of the ones that you had us spend some time with was David Bosch. He very famously, I think, and I'm not even sure if he was the only one that said this, but had said that the church does not have a mission, the mission has a church. And I'm just wondering, in reflection to some of those thought lines, how has disability, whether that is through personal experience, people you know, communities, or lived encounters, reshaped your understanding of what mission actually is over the years?
Yeah. Yeah, I think to participate in the mission of God, there has to be something of a self forgetfulness so that it can be God's mission and not our mission. When that occurs, and I don't think it does very often, but when that occurs, then that changes kind of all the use the word hermeneutics, it changes all the interpretive values, right? If you think of your church as or the church as having a mission rather than participating in God's mission, then you're always thinking about how can we grow? How can we get bigger? How can we be more successful in what we're doing? How can we raise our profile? And when you're in ministry that way, that's a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety around performance. And when performance becomes the measure of your community, then you're not as open and sensitive to the gifts of everyone. So I think to the extent that a church, and I've seen a few and know of a few that have become that kind of forgetful about their own survival, their own viability, and that allows them to be more aware of God's gifts given everywhere, you know? So I've been with big churches that where all of the seats for disabled people are in the back or in the corners, or and there's not a ramp up to the stage. And so they have made already decisions about how many people they can get in that space without thinking about accessibility and without thinking about the entire community.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I've been in churches. I don't know if I think you may have already been through the degree when we found a Methodist church in Durham, North Carolina. And they did so many things that were impressive in terms of welcome. They had both English and Spanish up on the screen at all times. Sometimes they led songs in Spanish, sometimes in English. They'd lead prayers in English or Spanish. But they also allowed children to run around with the streamers up front during the song worship. And there were always people in wheelchairs on the front rows. So they were highly visible, and it was a flat floor. So there wasn't a distinction between the stage and the rest of us. And they had good preachers, but everybody, not everybody maybe, but the full-time people didn't preach every week, and they would pass a mic around after the sermon. I remember the first time I was there, I don't know what the young man's disability was, but he was the first to grab the mic and after the sermon. And he knew a lot of church things to say, didn't really go along with the sermon so much. But the fact is, the community embraced that, and so I think there are places where they think more about a true welcome and not kind of a cosmetic welcome of kind of typical, neurotypical, physical, typical. I don't know what the right language to use is, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They think about people like them.
Yeah. Yeah. They talk about us, but us is only confined to an imagined normalcy. So,
Yeah.
just a funny story from my memories of the being with you guys. I do remember the church in North Durham there, you guys talking about it. I didn't get to go, but I remember you guys discussing it, and I was zooming in, right? And I remember Donovan and I kind of joking around, and I said, hey, they were talking about what should we wear. And I said, I think I could probably get away with not wearing pants because nobody would know and I'd be in church.
Yeah.
It was a funny memory I remember,
Yeah.
but talking about design a bit too, I think a lot of times churches will claim accessibility because they put a ramp or something in the back of the stage. You can enter from the back.
Right.
But how is that a sense of inclusive belonging
Right.
when it's almost a mask from the front?
Right.
That the only way you can really enter and belong and take part from the front is you have to go from the back.
Right. Well, this is the problem about the stage being the focal piece of architecture in a church building rather than the table. And with the explosion of contemporary Christian music, stages have gotten bigger. And because you've got sound monitors and drum kits and 4 or 5 musicians and 3 or 4 singers, and I mean, they have to rearrange things for me to get up and preach, much less make room for someone else. But at the table where the focal piece of architecture, that is a place of welcome. And I think that could then, if that were imaginatively lived into, it would change all the conversations about accessibility. And so make that shift now, all of you.
Yeah, I think you wrote a blog piece one time too, talking about how if everyone sat at a table and it was all around the table. Yeah. I'd kind of like to talk a bit about discernment a bit too. So talking about, in your book, it seems good to us and the Holy Spirit. It draws, of course, from Acts 15:28. And that is also a moment where the early church faced a crisis of belonging. For those that are listening and might not be familiar, Acts 15 is kind of the first council, if you will, of the church. And they were wrestling with the idea of do they accept the Gentiles as part of the Christian community, being predominantly because they were not circumcised. So Acts 15 centers on whose bodies are required to change in order to belong. How does this passage challenge contemporary churches in their engagement with disabled people?
Yeah. Just stating it the way you did is something I wish that I had focused on when I wrote the book. That they were requiring bodies to change. And I'm following both people like James Smith and some Pauline scholars who've written on the body and Paul's thought, and that spirituality in spiritual formation, that formation is not primarily an intellectual thing or even an emotional thing, but that our bodies lead in forming us, that they shape our desire, and what we do with our bodies, like Paul says, offering our bodies as living sacrifice. And then comes the renewing of the mind. So the first thing is surrendering your body as living sacrifice. And in that bodily movement, then how you view everything changes. There's a renewing of the mind, and then Paul says, so that you might know what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And that word know there is one of the words he uses for discernment. So I wish that had been foregrounded more when I'm thinking about Acts 15, because not only are you talking about a physical change to someone's body if you're a male, but you're also creating room to make sure that you can sit together at table, which is, again, a physical act. It is something we do with our bodies. So abstain, don't eat food sacrifice styles, and I think we'll be able to eat together is kind of Acts 15. All that to say that we've at least overlooked the importance of the fact that we are embodied people when we think about discernment. How do most churches discern things? They say, we'll go home and pray, and then we'll get back together and discuss it. But they don't eat together, That's not a part of their imagination about discernment. They don't share goods, They keep their own private stuff private, and they don't share their physical goods with one another. So, I don't know, Eric, you're making me think about new things here. What do you think?
Yeah, there was a couple verses that came to mind while you were sharing, and one of which is, of course, when Paul talks about the fact that the body is the temple to the Holy Spirit. And I think that do we treat all bodies as living presence, living temples for the Holy Spirit in our community without the expectation of productivity, but simply the relationship of being present with God in body and in form. And I might be imprinting a bit as well, but one of the other thoughts I had is, did Jesus not say, be of one body and mind? And I think that that's something else that as a community, we need to reflect on the fact that, there are hands and feet, there are different elements to the body, but we are of one body and one mind. And we're not to treat those who are of difference to us as lacking or less than what all of us share as the image of God. And I think that is, something that I think is being lost in the church today. I guess the other thing too, I wonder is, we haven't used this word yet, but I know it from other conversations, that a lot of times there is this cure mentality, that the bodies that are perhaps not accepted as normal are expected for cure, whether that be in this life or the next, and are somehow not fully enfleshed.
Yeah.
To be accepted or belonging in the community. One of the questions I put down was, who bears the burden for adaptation in the church today? And jumping into it a bit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I think a lot of times it's the disabled who are often set to the side and said to adapt to what the church offers. And if you don't fit that, then accept that you are apart from it.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right, and I'm sure I've been guilty of that. I think it's the same kind of dynamic. You know that in the MRE, outreach is a swear word because it assumes that the church has all the good stuff and other people have all the need. And then we wonder why all these people who are being kind to don't end up becoming members of our church. And it's precisely that care that adds to the cultural burden of having to enter in the first place. People who are used to being stared at want to be at a place where they're not stared at. So they've already got that kind of social, cultural thing to overcome. But then they've also got the paternalism of the church who thinks, aren't we good to accept you? Look at what we're doing for you, and never asking, what do you bring? What gifts do you have? How will you enrich our community? So yeah, again, I hadn't thought of it as kind of a cure mentality, but it is, right? Yeah, I know I've been guilty of that. So I remember embarrassingly telling a person whose um, mentally handicapped daughter had died that won't it be great in heaven to just talk, you know? But she was perfectly created for love now, you know, and relationship now. And you mentioned the image of God. Historically, Christianity has defined the Imago Dei as kind of an intellectual, a reason or will capacity. But clearly, then that would single some people out as not bearing the image of God, So I think it's right to insist that its body, it is relationship, which I think relationship is an embodied thing, fundamentally embodied. Anyway, I'm jabbering on. So you've got questions.
No, that's this is good. And I think it's important too for people to hear that we're all on a journey too. And so learning about how we encounter the things that are maybe rocky for people to hear. That's what the grace of God is about too.
Yeah.
It's important for us to receive with grace and to embrace with love. That's what will bring the change as well. As we grow into one another relationally, those rocky elements will smooth out into something beautiful.
Yeah.
Disability theologians often note that accessibility is a form of confession. It reveals what and whom we have silently centered. I think that might be bridging into something here. I want to talk about a bit about theology, and I want to reframe this question a bit from what we were talking earlier. I think disability theology coming together with missional theology. And I know quite often what I've heard is that disability is a small section off. I remember us learning about missional hermeneutics being the Venn diagram of the three, right? The context, the culture, and then you probably don't remember my paper, but I bridged it into the Christology, and we bring those together. But I'm wondering how does disability culture and theology marriage into and come together with missional hermeneutics to reveal the word differently as we encounter scripture?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't fully know. At that point, you and Bonnie will be my teachers because how you read text will hopefully be an expression of who you are and what you experience. And that'll be your entry into a text. It'll be your interpretive bias. And in this case, I think fruitful one, to use Gadamer's notion of fruitful prejudices, that they enable our knowing. They don't just block our knowing. So, like a practice like dwelling in the Word, which we did in our program, puts the text between me and you and requires me to listen to not teaching about the text, but where the text grabs you or what you noticed, and I think I don't empirically know this, but I could imagine that a person in a wheelchair notices different things than a person who doesn't sit in a wheelchair. So, more broadly speaking, some of what we did in missional hermeneutics was we read from Michael Barham, who talked about the fact that missional hermeneutics isn't so much an ideological posture from which we encounter texts, but is more kind of a living, relational, communal kind of encounter of the text in which those who are different and other than us can interrupt our own kind of imagination or interpretation of. In that sense, then I think disability shouldn't be a corner of missional hermeneutics. It should be more centered. And the difficulty is, unless I'm sitting with you, it doesn't occur to me, So I think that again, I wrote last week about the Bible as a literature of grief and gave the book of Joshua as an example that you don't want the empire reading Joshua thinking God has given them the right to conquer other nations. Evidently, we're going to hit Cuba next, right? Hitler made great use of Joshua as kind of biblical warrant for attacking the countries around him in the name of the Third Reich. It's different if African slaves and hush harbors are reading Joshua and dreaming about their liberation by the hand of God. And that's totally social location, right? That's totally where you live and what your relation to power is and what your relation to cultural norms are. So, yeah, I think it should be centered more. There needs to be more writing about it. Churches need to do a better job of shaping the imagination of people who are members of their churches.
Yeah. I'm going to express a little bit of grief of my own and probably get myself in trouble here. But one of the things and challenges I've had with trying to encourage local pastors and local leaders about listening to and engaging and learning about the disabled culture and community here in Calgary, which is, I don't know what the stats are where you are, but here in Alberta, 1 in 3 Albertans are considered disabled. And 27% of that is physically impaired in a wheelchair or using a particular aid of some sort to get around.
Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of different breakdowns there. But the anguish that I'm getting is, well, we don't have a lot of disabled people in our church. And I almost want to yell back. Does it ever occur to you to ask why?
Right. Yeah.
And it's kind of frustrating that, or maybe you want to go to that other church down the road that does have a disability ministry for you to get involved with. And it's like, I'm here. This is my home. We are neighbors. Let's love our neighbors as ourselves. And so the thought that came into my head when you were talking about is, when we ask about who is taking part in the theology or the book of grief is not the disabled who are experiencing the book of grief. It's the grief that, wow, this is going to get me in trouble here, Mark, but the grief that the church is causing in the disabled community
Yeah.
that is creating the separation and the loss of the gospel. And
Yeah. Yeah, I think you'll be all right, Eric. If that gets you in trouble, send them to me.
thanks for having my back, Dr.
I
Mark.
got your back.
But I think this is a great bridge into something that's going to be probably unique, considering you're coming from a US side and we're up here in Canada. But if we talk a bit about church and politics and belonging, it's been attributed to many ethicists, but it's been said that the measure of society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable members.
Yeah.
I know you've written lots about this on your blog too, in a Canadian context and perhaps on the US, where conversations are happening a lot these days around healthcare, around MAID up here in Canada, which, if you're not familiar with, is medical assistance in dying, on housing and disability supports, and lots of other stuff. What responsibility does the church have to resist the narratives that frame disabled lives as expendable or curable?
Well, I would think it would be the church would bear responsibility at several levels. The first is at the advocacy level. And by that, I want to avoid any kind of paternalism, but providing the opportunity for the voices of the disabled to be heard. Not speaking for them, but giving them an opportunity to speak and to be heard and to be honored by someone listening to them. I'm going to present a paper in a few weeks at a conference called Churches as Public Companions in Grief. So that first level would be, and you said it a couple times already, presence, participation, making sure that whatever is within the power of the church to provide, that voices are heard that typically don't get heard. Then I think is ethically and morally a part of the gospel to vote that way. In a liberal democracy where we have voice with our vote, not to vote for our own comfort and well-being, but to vote for and with the widow, the orphan, disabled, whatever kind of society we create that makes room, that provides life for people who are constantly having to struggle for life, and that the more we make life at the margins are a kind of political, social commitment, the more just our society will be for everyone. So, So those two things for sure. And then the third thing would just be to not just expect that people will listen to each other, but provide planned opportunities for that to happen. So in America, right, in the US, you're in America too, I realize, but in the
But we're not
US,
Americans, Mark.
you're not in America. Um, yeah. So we have a lot of rage right now going on down here south of the border. And so being a public companion in grief, we're mad because of what we fear we've lost. And so we're grieving. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as owning the libs or beating MAGA. You know, we divide into teams. And I don't think that it's reasonable to think that we should be able to get everyone to agree. But it is reasonable, more reasonable, to move the goalposts to understanding. And someone who feels understood, I think the rage level goes down. So I would think there'd be a parallel there with the grief that your community experiences, Eric. If there were regular places where you knew that someone was trying to understand you. So I think that's where I'd start, those three things.
That's awesome. I'm going to set a surprise question on you here. I just thought of while you were sharing. Particularly down in the US, you guys have the Disability Act to protect disability rights. And I'm curious on if the Disability Act has at all shaped the way church forms and the way the church practices, as opposed to up here. Because Alberta actually tried to pass a Disability Act recently and it was shot down. It was denied. Alberta is actually the only province in Canada that does not have any form of Disability Act, but it also does not have a disability representative in the government. And there's a strong push for trying to find that advocacy, but it's being resisted. So I'm curious if that Disability Act has shaped or changed any way the church may be different in the South to what it is in Canada.
Yeah, I wish I could say yes, but I don't think, I think it has, ironically, more impact through like the Department of Education. My wife, Donna, does all the kind of technical side of our online learning, and she is constantly harping on faculty for disability standards and access standards, and which otherwise we would not even think about. And it's not because, although Donna is a huge advocate for this in our university community, but it's the Department of Education that mandates it. And so when our accrediting agencies come through, they're going to look for that, and they're going to ask questions about that. Unfortunately, churches don't have an accrediting agency, So I wish I could say that that there was kind of a reciprocal influence between the legal and the ecclesial, that those were And maybe there was when the Disability Act was passed, but I don't know about that history well. But I don't think, again, I think all the city codes and, the Department of Education guidelines has way more to do with how we think about all that, which is to say we don't think about it until we're made to think about it, you know?
Okay, yeah. This is a great opportunity to dive into your work with 1528 Collaborative, I think. So I'm excited to hear about what you're up to now, what's happening with the program and with 1528. Do you want to tell our listeners a bit about it first, and then?
Yeah. Well, by the program, I expect you mean the MRE, and I don't have anything to do with that anymore because I don't work for Rochester anymore. And sadly, um, all the hard work we did has evaporated in the last 2 years. The MRE doesn't exist. The undergrad degrees don't exist. We don't have any full-time theology and ministry faculty. It's stunning to me, and that's all I'm going to say about it.
Okay.
But 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, when my book was published, the Acts book, that was such an enjoyable thing for me that I knew right then I didn't want to spend the rest of my career, which is, late fall in my career. I didn't want to spend it assessing student learning and writing syllabi and grading papers and telling Eric Freiberger his posts were too long. And, I didn't want to do that anymore. Well, I wanted a little bit of that. So, and the book was received real well, both at kind of the academic level, but also by ministers and practitioners. And so I'd been doing consulting for the last 20 some years anyway, as I had time and opportunity. And so the book was the occasion for me to pivot and say, I want to work now more directly with churches and leaders in churches. 1528 comes from Acts 15:28, as you pointed out. So I started the 1528 Collaborative, and we do a lot of different things that are all aimed at helping churches and leaders adapt and thrive in a new missional era. So, I do consultancies with churches who are looking to kind of make a culture shift. One of the observations I make in the book is that churches want to have 1528 moment, but they have none of the practices that would get them there. They're busy doing other things and pursuing the living God. So if you want to make that shift, how do you make that shift? And I can help with that. But we do online seminars, leadership seminars. We have new ones starting Monday. Mercy, Not Sacrifice, Leadership in Matthew's Gospel. Another one coming in August on leading communal discernment. So we're rotating 4 now, so 1 a quarter. We do those. They're pretty cheap. They're good to do with groups. And then we do retreats for adaptive leaders. Richard Beck has led one. Pat Kiefert has led one. Sherelle Russell, Shauna Songergains, Scott Hagley will lead one eventually. And then, my blog, which is part writing, part podcast kind of thing. I'm still trying to blow that up. And I've just launched kind of a curriculum endeavor. I wrote a study guide to go with my book, the Acts book, and I got notified today that it shipped today. So I'll have new copies of that. The book's 12 chapters. We have 12 units in the study guide. I'm kind of excited to see what happens with that. But then I'm also thinking of doing small group or adult study curriculum where I do a 15-minute video introduction and then 35 minutes of discussion. So I'm shooting for the first one of that to be out May 31st. So I don't know. I'm doing other things too. I've helped two churches recently kind of do leadership audits where churches are very unorganized and they know what they call people, but they don't always know how you become one or what it is exactly that you do. And so I'm doing some of that work too. But all of it is designed to make churches more discernment-oriented spaces. And so I work with leaders, I work with congregations, I provide a variety of resources. So that's what I'm doing.
This is all awesome. I hope I get to see some more of that too. I've always enjoyed following along with your podcast and blog, and I hope to chime into some of 1528 collaborative stuff. That would be cool.
Yeah.
I got to ask, and I hope I hope it's okay, but I'm curious how 1528 might be making space for disabled voices and in shaping the church's future.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say it's not front of mind, So it will show up to the extent that I'm sensitive to it, but I don't have like a product, I'm not aiming something specifically at that in that direction. So again, you're making me work, Eric.
Oh.
Now I'm gonna have to figure that out.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get more work on that huge plate. That's a lot there.
You're trying to make me a Christian, and I don't like people who do that, I just want to be a fan of Jesus. I don't want to, have to be a follower.
Right. Well, then I better ask you something fun. Tell me a bit about Bob Dylan. You didn't mention Bob Dylan in the record collection. Yeah, where's he connecting with all this?
Yeah, well, yeah, he's coming to town in about a month, but I saw him in Dallas about 20 years ago at the House of Blues, and I had heard that Dylan's kind of off and on, live, that he can be engaged and energetic, and then he can be the opposite, and I got him on a good night. So I don't want to risk that memory by catching him on a bad night. But I don't know, it's amazing. The dude's in his 80s and he's been touring forever and he still is. And every now and then producing new music. I love the Timothy Chalamet movie where he plays Dylan. I thought it was very well done. So I think there are ways in which Dylan's, particularly the early Dylan, is relevant in a new way again, like he was during the Iraq War. When Eddie Vedder covered Masters of War, and that's a cover you should find and listen to. It'll send chills down your spine.
I'll try and link it to the show notes.
Yeah. So, I don't know, I still buy whatever he puts out, and I just won't see him in concert again.
What did you think of the movie? The Dylan movie?
Yeah, I loved it. I thought Chalamet was great. I thought the woman who played Joan Baez was great. So definitely, I've seen it twice. It'll definitely be a movie I return to here and there. I like the fact that Dylan made them include something that wasn't true. He required that, and that's his whole life. I mean, he's always inventing and reinventing himself. And so it was in keeping with his entire career. Robert Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota becomes Bob Dylan, you know?
Yeah. Mark, I've really enjoyed having you on. I'm so thankful you agreed to join me here on the Well Dwellers podcast. Thank you for being here and sharing incredible wisdom. So much to share here. I hope our listeners are going to have pen and paper because there's a lot to write down.
Well, good, Eric. Thanks for being a great host.
Thank you.